speaker is Matt Davies. Matt has a BS in Environmental Archaeology from the University of Wales at Lampeter, an MS in Environmental Protection and Management, and a PhD in Fire Ecology. Matt studied fire behavior and ecological effects of fire on Scottish heathlands. Is that okay to say? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Scottish heathlands, and contributed developing fire danger rating systems for the UK. He looked at long-term dynamics in sagebrush ecosystems in response to repeated wildfires. Matt is currently assistant professor of soil and plant community restoration at The Ohio State University. So, thanks, Matt.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here speaking to you all, and great to be talking about sagebrush things again, which I haven't done for a couple of years. So just before I start, as well as the co-authors that were listed on the title slide there, I just wanted to make a few acknowledgements, because the data that this presentation is based on, based on a whole load of long-term data that goes back to the early 90s, and a whole load of people have been involved in collecting and marshalling that data. So Dave Wilderman, Jim Evans and Sonia Hall from the Nature Conservancy, Mike Marsh from the Washington Native Plant Society, and Mike Gregg from the Fish and Wildlife Service were really instrumental, as well as on my own project, our field techs there, Marita, Lorna and Elaine. We owe them all a lot of thanks. So the background to this research is we've been looking at repeated wildfires in sagebrush-steppe ecosystems in the Columbia Basin in eastern Washington state. And this was some research, this presentation is based on some research that we did 2009 through 2010 in the field, and we've been kind of slowly working on ever since. The focus site is the Fitzner-Eberhart Arid Lands Ecology Reserve, which is in the Columbia Basin, in south central Washington there. And we heard a lot about the Great Basin today. Obviously the Columbia Basin is also, well, formerly was really important as a sagebrush ecosystem. Large areas of it there you can see in grey, green and dark green have been lost to dryland wheat or apple orchard and vineyard development. But this area here in red that includes the Hanford Reach National Monument and the Arid Lands Ecology Reserve was formerly one of the last big intact areas of sagebrush habitat in our region. But it's an interesting site. So this map here shows that kind of northern part there to the north of the ridge of Rattlesnake Mountain is where the Arid Lands Ecology Reserve is. And you can see there's a really strong gradient in elevation there, from the dark colors, low elevation, to the white colors, high elevation up to 1,000 meters. So big differences in soil type, from sandy loam soils at the bottom to lithosols at the top. Big changes in precipitation and big changes in community structure, from big sagebrush at the bottom to three-tip sagebrush up near the top. So we had a really nice kind of environmental gradient to work across. The site really has been heavily degraded by repeated wildfires over the last 20 to 30 years, though. Back in the early 1980s, there was a first big fire, the Hanford Fire in 1984, which burnt pretty much the whole site. There was some restoration work done after that. A second really big fire in 2000, which is that blue outline there you can see, which again burnt pretty much all of the reserve. They did a whole load of restoration work after that, but then unfortunately pretty much the whole site burnt again in 2007, which is the kind of the red outline there as well. So repeated wildfires, and the concern when we got to the site was that we were entering into this kind of stereotypical wildfire cheatgrass feedback cycle, where compounded wildfires had pretty much extirpated native vegetation from large areas of the reserve, especially the shrub component, and cheatgrass was coming in despite repeated attempts with native reseeding and herbicide applications. When it comes to native reseeding, you guys know just how challenging that can be in very arid conditions. So those very heavily disturbed ecosystems at the lower elevations were very severely affected indeed. So we did a whole bunch of research looking at community dynamics and used some complicated multivariate statistics that will make your eyes water to try and figure out what was going on, and came up with a state and transition model that will make your eyes bleed because it's also pretty complicated. But what it all simplified down to, and what we were interested in for this kind of work that I'm going to present today, is that we could kind of present what we thought was happening on two axes that related to the relative abundance of native versus invasive species, and the relative on the kind of horizontal there, and the relative abundance of shrub versus grasses on the horizontal axis there. And these big sage bunch grasses, so when they were hit by repeated fires, they were kind of moved towards this bunch grass native forb composition, where we had big sagebrush that was had a cheatgrass understory where we'd lost the native vegetation. It was being pushed towards this kind of cheatgrass monoculture. And interestingly, the three-tip sagebrush, which I'm sure most of you know is a resprouting species, when we had the repeated fires there, we saw some greater resilience in that ecosystem because of the higher productivity at higher elevations, but also because of the ability of those species to resprout. So we had this idea that somewhere between the reproductive traits of the dominant shrub species and the disturbance regime, we could predict what was going to happen within these ecosystems. So what we thought was, well, we have this horrendously complicated state and transition model, but our concern was that what we're really seeing here is not transitions in state, but it's transitions in community composition, which may or may not be permanent. So immediately after a fire, yes, we can move to bunch grasses and native forbs, but that's not necessarily a state transition unless we get stuck there and we don't see any regeneration. So it's only really with long-term tracking of how communities are changing that we can assess whether or not we've actually got true transitions in state, as opposed to just fire effect followed by post-fire succession back to where we were before. So what we were interested to do was to see whether we could use this native invasive shrub grass axis to track the movement of plots within this space. So we used some independent data from the same site that was repeated measurements from 1994 to 2010, and we wanted to do a number of things. First of all, we took all that vegetation data and we simplified it down a little bit into kind of the species down into broad functional groups, so resprouting shrubs versus obligate cedar shrubs, perennial bunch grasses versus annual invasive grasses, and perennial forbs versus annual forbs. So we broke it down, or I should say lumped it together into these kind of 6 or 7 different functional groups, and used those to identify some community groups using cluster analysis. And then we took those individual groups and we tried to position them within that state and transition space that we'd hypothesized about. And within them, we wanted to assess how they moved around within that state and transition space as a function of the fires and restoration that they experienced. And these plots had experienced between 1 and 3 fires and a variety of different restoration treatments, including multiple herbicide applications, multiple reseeding efforts, and in some places, outplanting of big sagebrush. And hopefully, what we hoped was that we could take that movement and use it to test some of those predictions that we've made in our state and transition model. And if it worked, we'd hopefully have a nice, simple tool that could be used to track changes in ecological function in response to disturbance that didn't require you to do crazy multivariate statistics and actually only required you to go out and record very broad differences in vegetation type to figure out what was going on in your ecosystem. So we did that positioning within state and transition space by calculating 2 indices, which sound fancy. We've called them the S and I indices, but really they're very simple indeed. The first one, the S index, is just the relative abundance of shrubs versus other species, so that's graminoids and forbs. And the second index, or the I index, is just the relative abundance of invasive versus native species, so it's really pretty simple. And what that creates is this kind of state and transition space in which the dominance of invasive species is going to increase from left to right, and, oops, wrong button, excuse me. And the dominance of shrubs versus other species is going to increase from the bottom to the top. And just to be fancy, these are actually, the plot's movements are actually described on a log scale. So all that means is that there's really a lot of shrubs up here compared to down here, and a lot more invasives over here compared to over here. So you get this kind of exponential increase in shrubs from bottom to top. So we end up with a space that kind of separates out like this In the left, we've got an area where invasives are going to be completely absent. And in the bottom, we've got an area where shrubs are going to be completely absent. So this is basically some kind of grassland, and this is some kind of sort of pristine state where there are no invasives. So invasive dominance increases that way, and shrub dominance increases up the way, just as a reminder. And what we'd like to see is our communities somewhere in here. So no invasives or very low invasive cover, and some shrubs in there, so some sagebrush component retained. So let's see how our groups kind of plot out in this space. So we have 5 groups. And a group is characterized by high abundance of invasive species, a grass forb group where shrubs are at very low abundances, and it's very, very forb rich indeed. A big sage group, group characterized by lots of big sagebrush. An invaded sprouter group, so the shrubs are all resprouting species, but it's heavily invaded by cheatgrass, and a pristine sprouter group where all the shrub species are resprouters, so it's either 3-tip sagebrush or things like grey and green rabbitbrush, and there's no invasive species present. So here's our invasive group. You can see that some of them do have shrub cover, but what characterizes them is this really high abundance of invasive species. These 3 up here that have shrub cover all have big sagebrush. So these are like big sagebrush with a cheatgrass understory. Here's our grass forb community, so you can see very low shrub abundances or no shrub abundances and relatively little invasive cover. Here's our big sagebrush group, so high shrub cover and low or no invasives. Our invaded sprouters are up here, and here are our pristine sprouters. So variable cover of shrub species, but what marks them out is that there's no invasives present there. So what we can now do is look at how these move over time. And I'm just going to look at 3 of them, for the 3 groups for the sake of time. And we'll look at the invasive group first here, and what I'm going to illustrate is how they move from their starting composition in 1994 to 2003, which is 3 years after the first big wildfire they experienced, and then to 2010, which is 3 years after the second big fire that they experienced. So we'll see these guys move around within this space. So here they go after the first fire, and you can see they're moving from the top down to the bottom, most of them. So they're losing their shrub cover. And then after the second fire, that final plot, which retained some shrub cover, has lost its cover again. So we've got no shrub cover and that retained a high abundance of invasive species there. These dark colours here illustrate plots that were burnt 3 times. The mid-grey is a plot that was burnt twice, and the light grey that's burnt once. There's not really any pattern there, except that the plots that have really been pushed towards that kind of no shrub state tend to have been burnt more times than this one here that was only burnt once. It seemed to hold up a bit better. In terms of restoration treatments, all of these 3 plots down here received herbicide applications between 1 and 3 herbicide applications, which didn't really seem to make very much difference in terms of the abundance of invasives at the end. And these 3 plots here also received seeding treatments, so broadcast seeding treatments of shrubs and grass species. But again, it hasn't made a whole load of difference. They're still dominated by invasives, and there's no shrub cover come as a result of those seeding treatments. So second group we'll look at is our big sagebrush group. So this is the one that we're, I suppose, really, really interested in. We've got this high cover of shrubs dominated by big sagebrush and very little invasives. Well, this is what happens after the first fire. They're all pushed towards a new composition here, most of them experiencing very significant reductions in shrub cover or losing it altogether and becoming dominated by invasives. But interestingly, after the second fire, they've moved again. So some of them seem to actually have recovered their shrub cover, but they've remained somewhat invaded. So again, there was some variation in how often these plots were burnt, but no real difference. So this light grey one here was only burnt once, but this dark grey one here was burnt 3 times, but both have followed a similar trajectory in the end. So 1 or 3 fires can be enough to initiate these kinds of changes. Again, we've seen some herbicide applications here, which don't really seem to have had a huge amount of an effect. Seeding treatments, well, this is interesting, because the seed that was applied did contain some shrub seed, grey and green rabbit brush, and we've seen some recovery in plots that were seeded, but not all of them have recovered that were seeded, recovered the shrub cover. And one plot that recovered shrub cover also had experienced sagebrush outplanting. The final group we'll look at then is our pristine sprouter group. So these are the plots that are dominated by resprouting shrubs and have no invasives. So this is what happens after the first fire. So they're pushed towards a more invaded state, but generally speaking, they've retained their shrub cover. None of the plots have really lost their shrub abundance. And after the second fire, there's really rather little movement again. So this is kind of what we expected from our diagram. These plots with resprouting shrubs with a mechanism that allows them to regenerate rapidly after fire seem to be a lot more resilient. Yes, the kind of opening up of space following the burning has allowed invasives to come in, but the shrub component has been retained and they're somewhat more resilient. All of these plots were burnt 3 times as well, which is interesting. There wasn't much restoration work going on at these generally higher elevation type sites. One of them had herbicide application, but it's not really shown much effect. So what we are interested to do then is to calculate some further metrics from this information that allows us to characterize the resilience of these communities. And we looked at 2 ways of doing that. The first is that we can look at how these plots have moved around in this space over all the years for which we have monitoring data. So if you look at the whole trajectory over time, it's somewhat more wiggly and complicated, which is why I just showed you the move over 2 years. So we can characterize the length of this wiggly line as something like the stability of those plots. So how stable they are in response over time in response to these multiple disturbances, fire and restoration. So we can measure the length of that line basically. And we can also characterize resilience as how far away the plots are from their initial location by the end of our monitoring period. So I hope that makes sense. So the position from here to here and from here to here is the resilience of those plots, how far away they've been pushed from their initial composition. And this is what the results look like for this graph. And there's some interesting results here again. So generally, these big sage plots had, so I should say that the axes are a little bit counterintuitive. So high values of stability actually mean they're less stable because they've moved around more, and high values on this resilience axis actually mean they're less resilient because they're further away from their initial composition. So these big sagebrush plots actually aren't very stable and aren't very resilient. These pristine sprouter plots, they have kind of moderate stability. Some of them move around quite a lot, but most of them are fairly resilient. There's not really any difference in resilience amongst them. They all end up fairly similar distance away from their initial composition. And finally, what's interesting here is with this invaded plots is we see this kind of separation between a group down here in red and a group up here. So these ones are very unstable and have very low resilience. These are the plots that were cheatgrass understory beneath big sagebrush, where they've lost that big sagebrush cover and really moved a lot over time, whereas these ones were just a cheatgrass monoculture before. So we could conclude that these kind of plots are in some kind of stable state, in a stable invaded state. The grass forb community appears to be relatively stable. The pristine sprouter appears to be relatively stable and resilient, but the big sagebrush group really isn't very stable or resilient at all. So, is that the whole story? Well, the answer is no, it's not. So if we look at that big sagebrush group, we know things are a little bit more complicated. I alluded to that already. So if we just look at the abundance of different species in that group, on average we can see in 1994 that you had quite a big cover of shrubs here in blue and grasses here in green. By 2010, that had really changed very significantly. And what we got was this big dominance by forbs. The grasses had expanded a lot and the shrub covers declined somewhat. But what's really interesting is that the big change is that sagebrush is nearly absent. So this is kind of what the plots looked like in 1996. So big cover of sagebrush. This is before the fires came through. And this is what they look like in 2010. I mean, it's very pretty. If you like phlox, it's great. But and there's occasional scattered sagebrush through there. I mean, this is one of the most beautiful sites I've ever worked on, but you wouldn't really call it a Sagebrush-Steppe anymore. It's some kind of weird phlox, Poa secundus steppe. I don't know what it's supposed to be. So, but there are scattered shrubs in there, but most of them are resprouters. Most of them are grey and green rabbit brush that are in there because they were part of that reseeding mixture, and there really hasn't been that much recovery of big sagebrush. So our state and transition space can tell you something about how plots are moving. It seems to be a good, simple measure of how we can measure the resistance and resilience and track change over time. It's certainly a lot easier to do than doing complex multivariate statistics, but we need to keep an eye on some of our target species at the same time. So, what are we up to now? Well, we're continuing to work on this data. One direction we're trying to take is to look at the community composition slightly differently, so actually characterize what's going on in the shrub canopies separately from what's going on in the understory, and see if that allows us to tease out some of these more complex patterns a little bit more. We also want to try and model the probability of transition between those 5 different groups. So at the moment I've just shown you this information in terms of the initial group membership, but we can also look at what the group membership was at the end and model the probability of changing from one type of community to another. And we're going to try and test and expand these ideas, and happily for us, we've got more funding from the GFSP to go back to these sites and expand this approach on another big area of sagebrush called the Yakima Training Center, which is fantastic because the big problem for us on our existing site was everything had been burnt, and there was no control sites, or very few control sites for us to compare our trajectories to. So YTC has a lot more undisturbed area, well, undisturbed by wildfires. It's had tanks drive over it, but that's kind of a different story. So in conclusion, the movement of those plots within our state and transition space seemed to match our predictions. And the distance that was moved by the plots seemed to be a function of fire history to some extent, the number of fires that have been burning within our monitoring period. Restoration treatment had some effect on that big sagebrush group in that it seemed to bump up the sagebrush, the shrub dominance, I should say, in some of the plots, but seeding of grasses and herbicide applications really didn't seem to have much effect. And plant reproductive traits, so obligate seeders versus sprouter shrubs, seem to be important. There was very limited evidence of recovery from invasion. The basic general story was everything was being pushed over towards that invaded side of the state and transition diagram. And the loss of shrub cover could be reversed, but we didn't see any return of our keystone species. So we think it's a promising way of providing a simple mechanism to track state and transition and to figure out whether plots have changed over large distances and then become stable, or whether they're continuing to bounce around all over the place. It'll allow you to track response to restoration treatments and to subsequent fire events. So that's it from me, and if you have any questions, delighted to answer them. And if you don't get to ask a question, that's my email address.
We have plenty of time for questions. Fire away.
Yep. So these are relatively low elevation sites, measuring soils, I'm guessing 10-inch precip.
Yeah, so it varies quite a lot. So the lower elevation, should I repeat that question?
Yes.
So the question was whether they were all kind of low elevation sites with warm mesic soils. Our site actually encompasses a big range in elevation. So down at the low elevation sites, so those red invaded sites tended to be low elevation sites. The groups that came out as big sagebrush, they were kind of middle elevation, so slightly more precipitation. And the sprouter group that we looked at, that was actually high elevation, 3-tip sagebrush mostly. So there's quite a lot more precipitation there, quite a lot cooler.
But you're still probably, with high elevation, you're talking maybe like 3,000 feet.
Yes.
So I'm curious on why was the seed flown on and not drilled on that type of site?
There was some drill seeding after the 2007 fire. I couldn't tell you why that decision was made initially. I think there was some concern, especially at those lower elevations where the soils were very sandy, about the potential impact on soil crust integrity and the potential for soil erosion if drill seeding was used. And they did see those kinds of problems when drill seeding was used after the 2007 fire.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I think it's pretty evident given your results, but I'd just like you to state, I mean, so then for your implications for restoration strategies in these ecosystems, what would you recommend?
Okay, so the question was, what would my recommendations for restoration be? Well, the major conclusion of our project was, it's similar to what we've heard in previous presentations, actually, that those higher elevation sites, that the more productive sites with the resprouters, the appropriate thing to do seems to be to leave them. They seem to be able to recover. They've recovered from 3 compounded disturbances pretty remarkably well. The big challenge is at those heavily degraded, low elevation sites. It's going to be really interesting. I'm hesitant to make any recommendations at the moment because we were only there a maximum of 3 years after that final fire. And 2 years after the kind of final set of reseedings had happened. All the reseeding that was done after the kind of 2000 fire, that good work was basically wiped out by that second compounded disturbance. So one of the interesting things for us now is we're going to be going back to this site, and it's going to be 10 years now since the last fire. So making that comparison and seeing whether those restoration treatments have had an effect will be really interesting. I mean, the big problem, as always, was that some of the restoration seedings seemed to take after that first fire, but it was very heavily dependent on precipitation in the spring. So, you know, if you get a bit of precipitation, then you have some luck, but you know, you're really crossing your fingers when you're spreading seed around.
See you back there.
Really quick, are these all on the same soil types that you confirm that sometimes soil data not be that great? And then, and maybe also take into consideration the fire severity. You're talking about the number of fires, what about the severity of impacts?
Okay, yeah, that's quick. So the 2 questions were, are all the plots on the same soil type, and did we take into account fire severity? No, they're not all on the same soil type. The soil type grades from almost pure sand at the lowest elevations up to lithosols at the highest elevation. So there is a gradient there, which is everything's correlated with everything else across that environmental gradient. So elevation, temperature, precipitation, soil type. So there's that kind of big environmental abiotic gradient that we're working across. It's hard to untangle what exactly is most important there. But yeah, soil moisture availability is probably critical. In terms of fire severity, we did try to look at that, and we tried to look at some fire severity data, but basically our issue was that the remotely sensed fire severity data we could get, where the sites were grassland before the fire, they were basically recorded as not unburnt, and where they were shrub before the fire, they were recorded as high severity. So basically all the fire severity data did was tell us where there were shrubs before the fire. So getting good fire severity data from remotely sensed information where we weren't there at the time of the fires is a difficulty in these semi-arid ecosystems, just because of the way in which they collect the data, where you get you have your post-fire image, which is all black and brown, and then you have your kind of comparative image, which normally is taken in September, and it's all brown. So all it detects is the green areas that had shrubs on them beforehand. So.
One more question.
So were the invasives that came into the Pristine sites post-fire different than the invasive that came into the other sites?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, so cheatgrass was were the invasives that came into the pristine sites the same as the ones that came into the highly disturbed sites? So the invasives, what invasive is dominant changed over time a little bit. Cheatgrass was by far the most abundant thing, but at those very, very low elevation, highly degraded sites, we saw a lot of Russian thistle and tumble mustard in the initial years following fire, which was then kind of replaced by cheatgrass later on. So get these weird carpets of salsola. And interestingly, where drill seeding had been used, the drill seeders have this kind of roller that has little squares behind it, and where it rolled across the sand afterwards, we'd see little squares. It looked like a checkerboard of salsola seedings, where you get these tight squares of salsola seedings that had followed the drill seeder. It was a little depressing.
Okay, we'll have to cut it off there. Please see him afterwards if you have more questions. Thank you.